During quarantine, my 4-year-old Benjamin and I played a lot of hide and seek. Well, hide and seek with a few extra rules. 1. I'm the only one that hides. He doesn't want to. 2. I have to call out yoo-hoo every few minutes, otherwise he'd never find me. And 3. When he gets close, I pop out a hand or foot out of my hiding spot, and he would shriek in excitement and say, "I see your feet," and giggle. 4-year-olds, let's be honest, they're not the brightest. And I didn't exactly have the money to buy him a ton of toys. We had just moved into this house a few weeks ago. The rent took up nearly my entire paycheck. I got all of the furniture from Freecycle, and we ate beans and rice often, and I'm still driving around a 20-year-old car.
Hide again!
Benjamin said, tugging at my hand.
Hide again!
He said excitedly.
Honey, it's almost bedtime.
Please!
Okay, but only one game, okay? Go count in the kitchen.
He ran around the corner as fast as he could. Counting out loud, I ran through the living room, and then I saw it, the hall closet. Perfect. I opened the door and ducked inside. It was a tight fit, all of those scratchy, furry old coats pressing up against me. But it was worth it, because the better the hiding spot, the more time I got to myself. I pulled out my phone and I started browsing through Reddit. Soon, his muffled footsteps sounded around the dining room. I waited a minute. When he didn't seem to be coming my way, I cracked the door.
Yoo-hoo!
She called out. His footsteps grew louder. I heard his muffled giggles as he walked towards me, and then suddenly he stopped and started going up the stairs. Watching him, I cracked the door open a little further, just in time to see his little feet disappear from the landing. Then I shrugged. No biggie. More time for me. I sat back down in my closet and I pulled out the phone.
Mommy!
I heard him giggle from upstairs. I smiled. I wonder if a mom invented hide and seek. It was quite brilliant. You get a few precious minutes away from your child, and then they're not even supposed to make much noise, but you're entertaining them at the same time. It was absolutely brilliant. I stopped. Every muscle in my body froze, but I heard it, clear as day, a soft, clear voice calling from upstairs. But Benjamin and I were home alone. Oh God, someone's in the house, and Benjamin. She burst out of the closet.
Benjamin, where are you?
I heard Benjamin's footsteps running above me, his giggles trailing down to me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She screamed.
Benjamin?
More giggles, and then Benjamin's voice.
I see your feet. I see your feet.
He said, excited, oblivious to the danger. No. I darted up the steps, screaming for him. I burst into his bedroom, but he wasn't there. Just his empty rocket bed, the comforter rumpled up. I ran back into the hallway, spinning around.
Benjamin?
But I didn't hear any footsteps, any giggling. The house was dead silent now. I ran into the guest bedroom, and it was empty. I ran over to the closet, threw it open and looked up and down. Nothing. Stumbling back out in the hallway, I crossed back towards my bedroom, the only bedroom left. I went inside and flicked the light on. Empty. Just stuffed toys aligned on top of the bed, and a pile of laundry untouched by the dresser. Only the rain and the hum of the fish tank filled the room. Heart dropping, I checked the other side of the bed. Also empty. I crouched to look under the bed. Empty.
Mommy? Mommy?
Relief flooded me as I heard his voice. The door to the bathroom opened a crack, and one blue eye peered out at me, wide with fear. I ran over and grabbed him, hugged him, and then hoisted him up and started out the bathroom. His eyes were still wide with fear, and they weren't focused on my face, but the spot just above my shoulder. I whipped around. It took me a moment to see it, but then I did. I stared at the wardrobe frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. In the shadows, poking out from underneath the hems of my dresses and coats, were 2 feet. In moments like this, the brain doesn't really work. It's too slow. Instinct, really. The smartest thing would have been to lock ourselves in the bathroom and climb out the window. But instead, I just ran down the hallway as fast as I could. As I ran down the stairs, I heard the weighted footsteps, slow and methodical, resonating through the house. I could still hear them pounding into my brain as I ran to the neighbor and screamed for help. The police came. They searched the house. They didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry either. So they promised me they'd patrol my street for the next few days. But that was really all they could do. I decided to stay at my friend's house for a few weeks until I felt safe again. But every time I closed my eyes, I could see them. Those 2 feet that looked so off somehow, swollen as if waterlogged, a bit too grayish in tone to belong to any normal person, toenails blackened and split. And I think back to that wardrobe, how I had gotten it for free, how the owner told me his mother had just died, and he was just trying to get rid of her stuff as quickly as possible. And I couldn't help but to wonder, how did she die? At 19, I was hired for the role of a correctional officer. I was one of the youngest there at the time, working at one of the most dangerous prisons in Australia. There were good times where the men I worked with would better themselves and make something out of their lives afterwards. But I saw all manner of things, from courtyard fights to public masturbation to murder and suicide, but none of that really stuck with me. You would think so, but no. But the one thing that did stick through my time there was a short-lived and supernatural experience. There was not a single drop of blood spilled. It was one of the most horrific and mind-altering things I had ever witnessed. It was a night shift. I came in at 7 p.m. We very rarely did night shifts, and this is one of my first since finishing my training. What usually was a staff of 200 people had dwindled down to no more than 30 by 10 p.m. We weren't left alone exactly, but we generally did rounds on our own every hour or so. I was prepared and ready to take on the night, and being the youngest on the team, presumably the most naive, there were rounds of light-hearted teasing directed towards me.
You'll have aged to 60 by the end of the night. Be aware of the crazies, young Padawan.
All sorts of naivety. The start of the shift was quiet, peaceful almost, no issues, no weird bumps in the night. The inmates were quiet, dead asleep in their cells. But around 4 in the morning, exhaustion was starting to sink in when I saw a figure shift at the corner of my eye, just outside the guard tower. At that point, I had just brushed it off as being sleep-deprived and left it to my exhausted mind and overreactive imagination. However, when I saw the figure move back to where it first initially moved, my alarm bells started going off. As quiet as I could, I turned in my chair to slowly face the windows that overlooked the courtyard, focusing my eyes on where I saw the figure move, attempting to peer through the darkness. And I saw it. Just a vague shadow. There was something there. Now, usually if we saw something strange, we immediately radioed in case it was a loose inmate. However, this thing was oddly shaped, inhuman, so I chalked it up to being an animal. But as large as it was incredibly unlikely. This was a max security prison, Nothing larger than a rat should be getting in. It took my tired brain longer than it should have to process this information. Moments passed in my weary mind as I kept focusing in the direction of the odd shape. Time seemed to stand still, but in a single moment, a whisper, the thought came something may be very, very wrong. My fatigued mind and body were instantly awake, as if I got a shot of adrenaline. Leaning over the control panel, I flipped on the main switches, turning on the outside lights, and nothing. Nothing at all. Just the pounding in my head from my heart as a rush of blood ran through me. I could hear my labored breathing filling the quiet tower. The radio crackled, and I nearly jumped out of my own skin. My supervisor had seen the lights flipped on from her unit, as she was currently doing her rounds. My voice cracking a little, I told her I thought I had seen something moving outside, but it was most likely just my eyes playing tricks on me. She laughed and said something that caused my skin to break out in a cold sweat.
We said to be careful of the night crazies. This is a lonely time, and the crazies are lively tonight.
Really? It's a sentence that doesn't entirely make sense, unless crazies was a descriptive word of someone or the name of something. I brushed it off as her and the team were just trying to spook the new kid, but still something lingered that told me something wasn't right. I had a half an hour of unnerving peace, and then it happened. Except this time it wasn't outside. It was coming from the inside. It started simple, just a light tapping, almost too faint to hear. Maybe it's one of the inmates in their cells. Inmates would get restless if they were confined in their cells too long. Tapping to banging, even blood-curdling screams. After a few minutes of thought, it dawned on me. It was coming from one of the unoccupied cells. I was still alone at this point, but my partner should have been arriving back soon after finishing their rounds. Looking through the thick plexiglass, I stared at the cell door for a few minutes, when suddenly the tapping stopped. My previously furrowed brow softened, in a picture of surprise, but mostly relief. No sooner as the relief was settling in, the scraping started, a long, painful sound, like someone drawing their nails across a blackboard. I cringed at the sound initially, but then the fear took over. It was hard to swallow. It wasn't loud, but it was there. It was happening when it shouldn't have been. I racked my brain on what to do. I radioed in and explained there was a strange noise coming from an unoccupied cell, and I was going to investigate. My partner gave an affirmative and reported they would only be a few more minutes. That is probably nothing, that I don't need to wait for them to check in on the cell. I wished he had asked me to wait. In fact, I was praying he would. Keeping my composure, I stood up, unlocking the tower door connected to the cell unit, and walked directly to the cell in a daze, without hesitation. This outwardly confidence was at war with my insides. My heart was slamming. My brain was screaming for me to stop. My stomach was tied up in knots. And even with all these warning signs that something was terribly wrong behind that door, it still didn't stop me from reaching for the latch. I opened the door, not turning on the cell light. All the cell lights turn on at the same time, and I didn't want to wake the inmates. The only light poured in from the central unit, my own shadow blocking most of it, letting a few dim streams through. I stepped in. As I stepped inside off to the corner to allow more light in, and I saw it. I was frozen in fear, staring at the back of whatever this thing was. It was crouched with a humanoid figure. Its skin was a sickly grayish-green color. Its legs bent backwards, with its kneecaps facing me. Its limbs were long and skinny, its joints large and bulbous, protruding from underneath its odd skin. It didn't even acknowledge me. It just raised its long arms up above its head, placed the tips of its grotesque fingers against the concrete wall of the cell, and slowly dragged its fingers down. I had been silent until this point. The fingers were halfway down its path when my breath escaped me. It paused. Then it started to stand, rising, as its knees cracked as it did. I couldn't move. Terror gripped me. Its head sat on a dangerously long neck that was almost the length of its demented body. It had to stoop so that its head wouldn't hit the ceiling. And then it started to turn. But before I saw its face, the room went black. My partner, who ran to the open cell door, found me out cold. I was sent home early that night. I expected to hear something about it when I went back into work, but strangely there was nothing. Not even a light-hearted teasing. It was like nothing had ever happened. Maybe they didn't want to say anything, thinking I'd be embarrassed. I was, honestly. I mean, what could have I possibly told them? A few months passed. I had finally settled back into a normal routine. I did some research on the prison. Many old prisons have wretched past filled with torture, but this particular prison was notorious for it back in the day. Abuse, hangings, psychological torture, you name it. I wish I had not did any research, because up until this point I had convinced myself that I was simply sleep deprived that night. What it brought up was nothing too haunting, just a typical graphic and gruesome history of the Goa'uld. However, I unearthed a diary entry that was written by a man long ago from those dark times, and on his last entry was the nail in the coffin. It has stayed burned into my soul. The walls we tap to make a song, the walls we scratch when nights are long. Day becomes night with no end. My hunger remains my only friend. Twisting my legs, they force them behind me. God or demon, whomever will see, let death come soon, I beg to be free. Instead their noose tightens and pulls as they have their way. I tap the wall singing until the next day. This happened to me about 10 years ago, in a small, rural town in nowhere, Idaho. I'm a female and I was 14 at the time. It was the summer of 2012, on a warm, humid night. My friends and I were walking through our small town, just being your typical teens, talking about the movie, The Dark Knight Rises, we had just watched. As I casually looked down at my phone, I realized we were cutting it close to our curfew, and we decided to take a shortcut through the cemetery. It was a very old cemetery, where some of the graves' headstones were no more than rubble. It had a distinct earthy smell to it, due to the humidity. As odd as it sounds, it felt welcoming. It was late, after hours, and I'm pretty sure it was illegal for us to be there at the time. But we really weren't doing anything, other than cutting through, which we would often do during the day as well. As we were walking down the path, we saw a pair of headlights turning into the cemetery, and the boys, of course, darted away, leaving me behind as they disappeared beyond the tree line. Since the boys ran ahead of me, off the path, and away from the lights, it was pitch black. There was residual light twinkling through the branches as I made my way down into the trees, but there was a slope, and it dropped down to a slight dip, and the light was lost, enveloped now by almost complete inky blackness. I carefully walked along, trying to be as quiet as possible, and to not trip, almost blind due to the fact my eyes haven't adjusted yet. And that's when the feeling of dread started settling in. I had no idea where the boys were. I couldn't see, and I didn't want to be caught by the police by myself. But there was something else. Almost a chill in the air on this warm night. I tried to brush off this uneasy feeling, thinking it was just my nerves or being scared because the boys took off without me. But alarms were going off in my head, the core of me having this unattainable warmth. I knew something was off. Something was very wrong. I shouldn't be out here. As that thought hit me, I could just make out a shape to the left of me, a dark outline of someone even darker than the night. As I'm walking, getting closer towards it, "Hey, guys, is that you?" I whispered, and nothing. No response. I take a few more steps forward, and I swear to God, just like the movies, a freaking twig snaps under my foot. Now, the reason I had thought it was the boys is because this shape was crouched down next to a pile of brush, and it was big enough to look like two people hunched over. I thought they had been hiding there. But when the twig snapped, I stopped in my tracks. This thing slowly rose, standing, its haunched figure now showing its mass. It easily towered over me. I was only 5 foot tall at the time, and this was easily two of me stacked right on top of each other. Whatever it was only 15 feet or so away from me, and I was frozen. I couldn't move. I even forgot my own existence. The sheer size of it and the dark outline only added to the soul-shattering fear. Standing there, looking into its gaze, I could hear this inhuman whispering all around me. It was as if the whispering had a spell on me, taking control of my body. It was just me and this thing that seemed like the personification of darkness itself. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. The woods around me through the peripheral of my eyes grew darker, like looking down a tunnel that closed around me. My heart pounding so hard, I could feel it through my entire body. Every nerve in my body was prickling. I was beyond cold, like the touch of death that was mere feet away from me, and its soulless eyes that made me feel like I was staring into the abyss of hell. Neither of us moved. We were locked in one of the most terrifying staring contests for what felt like a lifetime, until a strange feeling came over me. I felt like I could move again, and I had the energy to run a marathon. Then I heard a very calm but stern voice say, "Go, now, run." It's kind of hard to explain where the voice was coming from exactly. It was sort of in my head, but all around me at the same time. I'm getting chills just talking about it. I know the voice did not come from whatever this thing was in front of me, because when I heard the voice speak, it looked as if this hard creature recoiled at the sound of it. It took a step or two backwards and kind of ducked its head down. This was my chance, and I turned away from this creature and bolted down further into the tree line, no longer caring about being quiet, and I crashed through the bush like an animal chased by a predator. I could feel this thing right on my tail, but after running about 200 feet or so, I ran directly into the boys, literally crashing into them. I was obviously scared and pissed, so I asked why the fuck they left me like that. Apparently I had been missing for almost an hour, and they had already searched the direction I ran from. I didn't understand. How was that possible? I knew I hadn't been gone that long, not even close. In their search, they said they heard weird whispering voices all around the woods while I was gone, like the voices were coming from everywhere around them. It was impossible to pinpoint the direction of the voices, and they said the moment they saw me and I crashed into them, the whispering suddenly stopped. I told them about what I saw, and we all agreed we need to get the hell out of there. We left the cemetery, and the moment we walked past the gates, this deep foreboding that sunk so deep within me It was like part of my being just left, as if though I'd forgotten what reality even was. We never talked about that night again, even during the day. None of us ever took that shortcut through the cemetery anymore. I still don't understand how so much time passed that night, being in the same place with different times. But every so often when I'm lying in bed at night, I can hear the whispers. I try my best not to think about what happened on my way back from Tennessee about 3 years ago. There are so many things that happened that night, and none of them can really be explained. My girlfriend and I had gone on a 3-day vacation to Nashville in order to meet up with my buddy and his girlfriend. The trip itself was phenomenal. Plenty of alone time, poking through the small country shops, and generally just enjoying ourselves. It wasn't until we left for home that things got intensely terrifying. We left later than we should have. Honestly, just because of the fact that we were really enjoying being away from it all. It was around 9 at night when we hit Kentucky. We decided to stop at a rest area coming up. Even though it was a little shoddy looking, they always seem to be hit or miss, don't they? Well, this one was absolutely decrepit. We pulled up in our car and things just felt inexplicably off. We looked at each other and I could tell we were thinking the exact same thing. Something was very wrong. The lights were a little too orange. The fact that we were the only car there. All of it came down to one simple fact, that we both just felt in our bones. We just weren't in Kentucky anymore. We tried to laugh it off and decided that one of us would stay in the car while the other one went to the bathroom, and then we would switch. I don't really think we even questioned our mentality on it at the time, but rest assured, I would never let my girlfriend walk around by herself if I felt something was threatening out there. There was something fatigued in the air, scrambling our circuits and forcing us to make the moves we needed to make, to be by ourselves. My girlfriend went first and came sprinting out to the car in what was probably only 3 minutes. It felt like an eternity. I kept looking at the building, seeing things materialize out of the shadows, continuing to dissipate, as if they were made out of smoke. She came back into the car, and I took the time to jump out to do my business. Even though every fiber of my being screamed out at my ineffectual and numbed mind, I still trudged to the men's bathroom. I noticed that there was a lock on the outside of the door. My mind tried to process this insanity. A lock on the outside? My mind kept reading this piece of information to me over and over again, but I simply pulled the door open. The light had a sick, greenish tint to it when I entered the bathroom, and there was a large man with his back to me at the only urinal. He was standing unnaturally still, not even a sign of breathing. Imagine staring at a mannequin in the darkness, but with only a hint of light illuminating the unmoving figure. It was silent, with only the hum of the light. It was the knife that cut through the dead of silence. Unnerved, instead of waiting for him, I went directly into the only stall. As I was standing there trying to do my business, there was something in the back of my mind poking me, telling me that I didn't want to see his face. I felt like I was coated in molasses. Every movement, every breath felt like it was in slow motion. I could literally hear my own breath start to shake. I zipped myself up without even starting. I just needed to get out of there. I didn't want to hesitate. I knew I would lose my nerve. So I yanked the stall door open. And there he was, towering and standing directly in front of the stall. Breath escaped me, and I gasped in surprise. He was still standing, unnaturally still, as if somehow he was just placed there. You scared me," I stuttered. His face had a grin far too big, the curve of his lips going up the sides of his cheeks a bit too far. It wasn't friendly, but rather the grin of a madman that had never held back in his life. It was the grin of someone that wouldn't think twice about murder, a grin that reeked of sadism and unadulterated evil. His hair was stringy, dirty, and it hung around his shoulders. There were terrible boils on his face and neck, but that wasn't the worst visual, not by a long shot. He was missing an eye, but there was skin over the socket, as if he had been born that way. I doubted that he was ever born, though. This wasn't a man. If he had any humanity in him, it was dead in him, or it, long ago. Then suddenly he spoke.
"Care to wash your hands?"
He inquired politely. His voice didn't match his physical appearance. It was cultured and disaffected. Somehow the clarity of his voice with his appearance made him all more sadistic and terrifying. It felt as if though this exchange had lasted for hours. To this day, I believe that the only thing that snapped me out of my trance of fear was my one thought, my girlfriend. I darted past him and threw the door open with all my might. Funny, it didn't seem to be that heavy when I had entered. The man laughed heartedly. Coming from inside the restroom, it made a strange, echoing sound reverberating off the walls. Listening to his laughter as I ran to the car, I felt wrong. I felt off. The laughing, somehow hearing it inside my own head, like I was no longer alone in my mind. The feeling as if there was someone or something a fingernail's edge from my back. The sensation didn't go away when I looked behind me, and I didn't see anyone. I threw myself in the car. My girlfriend reversed quickly before the door could even shut. She slammed the pedal to the floor, tires squealing, as the rest area grew smaller in the side mirror. Once back onto the highway, I kept looking in the back seat anxiously. I was just convinced that we were bringing something home with us. I was so preoccupied with this morbid thought that I hadn't noticed my girlfriend staring at me strangely. She insisted that I wasn't myself. As I began to speak to calm her, my voice was not my own. Her eyes grew wide with terror. She screamed.
"Why the fuck are you smiling at me like that then?"
That snapped me out of it, and the feeling of someone else dissipated, like a shadow crawling back into the darkness it came from. Even my surety that something was in the back seat faded to a dubious confusion, and my girlfriend slowly began to understand that it really was me. Later, through tears, she told me that I had been smiling at her the same way that I described that smiling man. We tried to find a record of an abandoned rest stop or something terrible happening at one in Kentucky, but we couldn't find anything. We were in such a hurry to leave that place, neither of us looked around to see where it was. Something from hell hitched a ride with me that night. I can't even stand to smile anymore. Just know, if you're ever out driving and you need to stop at a rest area, make sure it feels right, because you can never know who or what could be waiting. Back in the 80s, I was in my early 20s. This was before I married my now husband, and when I would drive long distances back and forth between my parents and my boyfriends to visit. It was a transitional period for us. He had just graduated, and I hadn't moved out yet to be with him. It was a long drive across several states, through the cold night desert, which took me many hours. This desolate highway would have stretches of road that lasted hundreds of miles, where you quite often wouldn't see another driver, let alone a gas station. So I set out and began one of those journeys. A couple hours into the drive, I noticed a dark vehicle slowly catching up to me. I barely noticed it as I continued to sing along to The Air Tonight until the vehicle got aggressively close. I turned off the music and looked into my rearview mirror, seeing the vehicle flash its brights and a hand pointing at my car, motioning me to pull over. Alarmed, I quickly slowed and began to look for a good place to pull off the road to see what must be wrong with my car. The second I began to pull off the road, I felt and heard as clear as day, "Don't pull over." Then again, much stronger, "Don't pull over." Call it God, intuition, or just a gut feeling, but a jolt of adrenaline and fear shot through me. I hit the gas and peeled back onto the highway. Heart pounding, I asked myself what the hell was that? As I saw the vehicle peel out behind me, the dark vehicle continued to closely follow, flashing the brights and motioning me to pull over. Fear and confusion set in as I began to question what was going on. Why was the driver motioning me to pull over? Was there something wrong with my car? And what the hell was that feeling, the warning I felt? It would have been a severe situation if my car broke down out there, especially before the advent of cell phones. But I pressed on still, pushing the pedal harder as the road lines moved by me faster and faster. Just as my resolve started to waver, I questioned if I truly did feel what I felt. I started slowing back down when the dark vehicle jerked and picked up speed. It entered into the oncoming traffic lane and came to the level of my car. The driver smiled, pointed and motioned and mouthed the words, "Pull over." The second I looked into his eyes, I felt pure evil. A wave of horrible sickness in the pit of my stomach overtook me. Again I heard the words in my head, "Don't pull over." He was greasy, unkempt, and I noticed he was missing a couple of teeth in his smile. The teeth he did have were pointed and crooked, a rotted look. He sent a wave of chills through me. This quickly dispelled any thoughts I had about pulling over, and I floored it trying to lose him. He chased after me, the glow of his lights hidden by the rear of my car. I slowed down, and he would slow down. I sped up, and he sped up, mocking and mimicking every move I made. My mouth was dry. My hands ached on the steering wheel I gripped. The fear was overwhelming. He began to try to push me off the road, swiping in fast, coming in closer and closer each time. A threat I would be rammed off the road. I was at the point of tears as this monster continued to terrorize me out in the middle of nowhere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a couple of semis off into the distance. If only I could make it, to get close to them, or even get between the trucks, I would be safe. He continued to flash his lights, honk his horn blaring. He made a desperate last attempt, swiping in, coming in so close, I could see his evil grin, filled with rage and hatred. I swear I could smell his breath. It felt in that single moment we were alone and I had nowhere to escape. Suddenly, I was aware I was close enough to the trucks. I slowed down and drove in between them. I saw the dark vehicle slow way down, and eventually his taillights, like a pair of demon eyes, faded from my view. I sat there between the trucks, bawling, relieved yet terrified, staying with the trucks for a couple of hours until I felt safe enough to pull over at the nearest gas station, and I laid my head on the steering wheel, calming my nerves under the soft lights. Fast forward, several years pass. I am married now. My husband is working at a law firm as a high-profile criminal prosecutor in Las Vegas. I am now a full-time mom of several young children. I've always been obsessed with true crime. Dateline, 2020, and Unsolved Mysteries were always playing at my house. This day was no different. As I was folding laundry in the kitchen while listening to the TV in the other room, the interviewer was talking about a man who was being interviewed on death row. As I paired another match of socks, I heard the description of a man. In one of his tactics for procuring victims, according to him, he would wait along the side of a highway. A car would go by with a family, and he would wait. Another car with a male driver would go by, and he would continue waiting. But every so often, a car would go by with a pretty young woman driving alone, so he would pull out behind them and follow. He would flash his brights and honk and motion for them to pull over. I was paralyzed as I continued to listen to what he was saying.
They would eventually pull over. I'd tell them to pop the hood, and I'd be able to tell them what was wrong with the car. They would, and I'd yank a couple of wires. When the car wouldn't start, I'd let them know it was no problem, that my buddy has a shop next town. I can give you a ride, and he'll give you a fair deal.
I slowly moved into the living room.
They'd get in, and I'd rape them. I'd kill them. I'd bury them anywhere in the desert.
When asked how many times he did this, he responded,
They'll never find all the bodies. I can't even count, it's so many. And as far as how many got away, maybe 2 or 3.
I stood alone, staring at the screen. It was the same toothless grin I saw on the highway that night. It was Henry Lee Lucas. Mr. Shavinko was the toughest teacher in our high school. He was 6 foot something, a bear of a man who marched around campus with a look on his face that even the most unruly of students found daunting. Having immigrated from Eastern Europe after the collapse of the old Soviet Union, he spoke with a heavy accent, but his English was perfect. He taught physics in an emotionless, sterile manner on his bad days. His tone of voice could be described as a bark. One day, during an unusually interesting class, Mr. Shavinko was going over the different types of radiation that exist. A studious pupil in the front row raised a hand to ask him how he knew so much about the subject. "I did some work for the power plant in my home country," he replied dryly, turning to the chalkboard and beginning a crudely drawn diagram. One of the jock douchebags, who was known for being somewhat of a bully, made a comment about how it was probably him the one that blew it up. Mr. Shavinko's chalk snapped. The hand that gripped the broken piece trembled as he lowered it to his side. With an audible sigh, the teacher turned back around, his eyes fixed on the disrespectful jock. "Have you ever seen your friends die?" It was the first time any of us had ever heard him talk in a way that didn't make us flinch. but somehow his tone was even more frightening than before. The jock didn't respond. "I asked you a question, boy." The jock remained silent, his cheeks turning a shade of crimson as Mr. Shavinko's beady brown eyes bore into him. With the same flat facial expression, the furious teacher walked towards the classroom's door. The room shifted as he locked it. "New lesson today. Close your books."
Mr. Shavinko, sir?
A nervous-looking girl in glasses raised her hand. She was unable to hide the raw fear in her voice.
I don't feel comfortable.
"Shut up, girl. You thank the boy with a big mouth later. This is a collective punishment," Mr. Shavinko hissed, taking a seat at his desk. We waited, the tension thick in the air as we dreaded to think what Mr. Shavinko had in store for us. We'd never seen him as angry as he was now. Some people said they smelled alcohol on his breath some days. I felt a knot of fear in my guts as I pictured the morbid newspaper headlines that might follow the next day. "The most important time of my life happened before any of you were ever born," Mr. Shavinko began it. "It was the 25th of April, 1986, the day the entire world ended for my town. I had recently returned from Moscow after studying nuclear physics in the university there. I was glad to be home. It was the start of a new life for me. I had a girlfriend I hoped to marry once I found work. Pripyat, it was a beautiful place. Forest nearby, streams for fishing. That evening was warm with a clear cloudless sky. Above Pripyat was a ceiling of stars, a blanket of celestial bodies that you could lose yourself into for hours. But that same night, an accident near our town changed my life forever." I knew what he was going to say before he even said it. The words were on my lips before he even uttered them. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant. There was a saying in my homeland: "We pretend to work, and the government pretends to pay us." The class could see the sadness in our teacher's eyes as he spoke. It was like that back then. Communism had destroyed people's desires to better themselves. Years of incompetence and corruption meant that there was a design flaw in one of the new reactors. When the safety test began, the reactor was like a loaded gun, just waiting to go off. So when the control rods were removed to raise the power again, he calmly looked over the disrespectful jock, narrowing his eyes as he leaned into his desk. Mr. Shavinko's roar sent the jock reeling in his seat. The rest of the class didn't fare too well either. We were gripped, hanging on to our teacher's every word. But what no one knew, thanks to years of error and cover-up, was that there was a fatal flaw in the reactor design that made it unstable at low power levels. As power levels were lowered in preparation for the test, they dropped too low and the reactor ground to a halt. Meanwhile, unseen and dangerous hotspots were forming, building deep within the reactor. Two huge explosions that shook the earth beneath our feet. Every man, woman, and child in Pripyat heard the bangs, but we had no idea what it was. Some of the off-duty workers feared the worst, but none of us could have fathomed that what was about to unfold was the worst nuclear disaster in our history. I felt the shock wave as I looked towards the power station. A pillar of smoke rose up into the clear night sky, and though the inky blackness of night, I made out twinkles of flames in the distance. Some of the people in my apartment block thought war had broken out. Then myself and the people of Pripyat watched in awe and terror as a huge stream of ionizing radiation shot into the heavens, lighting up the night with a hideous blue glow. We thought the world was ending. For us, it certainly was. People were terrified beyond belief, but I must admit, I found myself smiling as I looked out into the night. It was titanic,
like looking at the face of God, a gargantuan mass of pure energy. It was beautiful. The melancholic look never left Mr. Shavinko's eyes, even if a small nostalgic grin did curl his lips. But that was only the start of it. What came after, both as a result of the accident and the government's mishandling of it, was much more horrific. The teacher never took his eyes off the jock, as if every single word was directed at him. It must have been torturous. It certainly was for the rest of us. We were forced to listen. We had no escape. Did you know that they bust in troops of entertainers to keep some of the nearer villagers calm as they died of radiation poisoning? Let me describe to you one such performance, Mr. Shavinko began. A beautiful ballerina dancing her final dance. Strands of her blonde hair floated to the floor as she twirled. I saw blood leaking from her nostrils, down her cheeks as it seeped from her ears. The children ran to her with flowers, their hair and teeth already starting to fall out. The generator stalled, and for several moments we were plunged into darkness. Into my complete and utter horror, I saw the flowers and the children glowing in the dark. There were a few gasps in the room. One of the girls in the back row was sobbing quietly into the sleeve of her sweater. The cleanup involved the work of 30,000 people, continued the teacher. There are less people in this town. Think of that. 30,000 people. They call them the liquidators, a disgusting euphemism coined by a man too cowardly to call them what they were. The condemned. Do you know what it's like, boy, to have to look your friend in the eye and tell him to walk towards his own painful death? Do you? Shavinko growled towards the jock. You look to me like you would have no problem, as long as it would save your own skin. 4 million people suffer today from something that happened 30 years ago. 4 million. He stood up and walking slowly towards the desk that now sat the terrified jock. And you think this is funny? Yes. The jock shook his head violently, still too terrified to speak. His eyes begged for mercy. Yes, you laughed. You think that seeing children being burned from the inside out, dying the most painful death imaginable, never knowing why or how they were being murdered by someone they couldn't even see. You think this is a joke, don't you? Mr. Shavinko towered over the boy's desk, eyes wide and full of fury. We waited for him to snap, for him to beat the living hell out of the kid. But he just turned, walked towards the door, and unlocked it. Class dismissed, he murmured. I've never seen a classroom of kids move so quickly in my life. Not even on the last day of school did we tear out of a building like that. But on the way out, I slowed, stopping near Mr. Shavinko's desk and feeling the anxiety build. He looked up at me, the same sadness filling his eyes as I spoke.
I'm sorry.
He just nodded, and without another word, I departed.
When a similar accident happened in Great Britain, and you'll be hearing more about that in a few minutes, British authorities suppressed the details for more than 25 years. It is hardly surprising, then, that the Soviet Union, which has an infinitely more secretive tradition, is revealing only the sparsest information about its own nuclear disaster. But disaster is how even the Soviets are describing it. But where they concede 2 dead, diplomatic and other sources claim that more than 2,000 may already have died.
This happened to me about 11 years ago, when walking home from my friend's house at night. I used to live in the rural part of the UK, and I have lived in the rural areas most of my life, so I was used to long walks, occasionally at night, especially before I could drive. They never bothered me too much. I'd get creeped out occasionally, but this one night was the most terrifying experience I have ever had. There was this one friend who used to live roughly 3 miles away from my house. He had pretty cool parents, and my other friends and I would often go over to his house and play video games, and just hang out. Occasionally this meant walking home at night if I stayed late. There were 2 ways back from his house. The roadway, which was about 5 miles long, and it took about 30 to 45 minutes. The roads were quite eerie sometimes, but they were well lit by street lamps, so it never bothered me walking this way. The other way was a shortcut through some woods, which took about 2 miles off, and the wooded bit was about a mile or so long. I often favored the wooded shortcut, and I have probably walked it over 100 times. The woods were dark, however. Combined with a lack of ambient light, due to living in a rural area, you had absolute darkness. Luckily, most of the time, I had my phone light to walk with, but sometimes my phone would die, or the battery would be so low the flash wouldn't work, and I would have to use my screen light. As you've probably guessed by now, this was one of those occasions. I remember my friends and I had just finished watching a film. It was nearing 10 p.m., so we all left my friend's house and headed our separate ways home. I contemplated briefly which way should I go and decided to take the shortcut through the woods. I started walking away from his house and towards the path that headed into the woods. The streetlights dimmed as I entered the fields before the woods. I glanced at my phone and saw my battery was very low, only enough power left for a couple of minutes of light, and then I would have to use the screen that wouldn't last the whole way either. As I saw the tree line approaching, I switched on the light and followed the well-trodden path into the dark. To my dismay, my light died within seconds of entering. I flipped my phone over to try to shine the way using the screen. As I walked, I looked out for the familiar landmarks I was used to seeing to ensure I was heading in the right direction. Funky tree stump, check. Half-fallen fir tree, check. Enormous puddle I'd had to jump over, check. All was going well. I was halfway through the woods when my phone completely died. I remember the moment it happened. I was engulfed in darkness. I'm not sure if you've ever experienced this level of darkness before, but it was so dark I couldn't even see the outline of my hand, just centimeters in front of my face. Naturally, my pace slowed considerably, and I started holding my hand out in front of me to make sure I wasn't going to walk into a tree or something. I continued walking for another minute or so, until all of a sudden a pungent smell hit me. It was cigarette smoke. I glanced around, but I couldn't see anything. Then I heard it. A cough. I wasn't alone. Thoughts raced through my head. Who would be out in the woods in the dark? Are they following me? Am I lost? I quickened my pace, throwing a little caution to the wind. I carried on walking and I tripped slightly on a branch. And as I regained my balance, I heard another sound. Branches breaking underfoot, what sounded like it was right behind me. The snapping turned into fast footsteps that grew louder and louder. I started sprinting. I felt the well-trodden path turn to brush. I felt branches and logs and plants hitting my legs. It wasn't long before I fell. I was lying on the ground holding my knee. I could still hear branches snapping around me, and a voice muttering something. I didn't dare move. Then all of a sudden, they turned on a light. I couldn't see anything except for the beam of light, which seemed to be eaten quickly by the darkness of the forest. I lay motionless on the ground as the beam swept through the trees. I could still hear the person mumbling, a deep growl. The crunching of footfalls grew and grew. They were only several feet from me at this point. I couldn't breathe. The light went out. The snapping of the branches grew, and then nothing. Just silence. My eyes were wide open in panic. I couldn't see anything. Then I could hear breathing right above me. I wanted to cry. I wasn't sure if the person could see me or not. They could have been staring right at me and I wouldn't know. This carried on for about 5 minutes until the crunching of the leaves and the snapping of the twigs started up again and got fainter and fainter as they moved away from me. I remained lying on the ground for another 5 or 10 minutes, contemplating my escape. Like an idiot, I'd ran off the path and I wasn't sure which way was back to it, or which way was home. I didn't care really. I thought I was going to walk in one direction until I found the woods and get home from there. I knew as soon as I started moving again, if the person was still in the woods, they would hear me. Should I run or try to sneak out? I opted for the latter. I slowly rose to my feet, listening constantly to my surroundings. I picked a direction, any direction, and started walking. I wasn't perfectly quiet, but quiet enough to be sure I wouldn't be heard from too far away. I kept hearing snapping sounds and rustling in distances, and every time I'd freeze. I'd hold my breath until I was sure that no one was there, and then started walking again. I repeated this pattern for what felt like an eternity, until eventually I found the path. I screamed for joy in my mind, and I sped up my pace. After another 10 minutes or so, I saw a light. Street lights filtered in through the trees. I'd never been so happy to see meager street lamps before, but as I progressed to the end of the woods, my heart sank. At the end of the path was a black silhouette, unmoving. Contrasted against the light background was the dark figure of a man. What should I do? Maybe it's a different person. Perhaps it's someone walking their dog. I froze, and then I watched them silently, but they didn't move at all. They just stood there. I wasn't sure what to do. I was so close to getting out, so close to the exit. I had to get out of these woods. I decided to run for it, to go straight towards the exit, straight towards him. I started running, and every fiber in my body was burning with fear. The figure grew and grew, and when I reached him, I dodged to the side, narrowly passing him. I felt something clip the back of my head and tug at my jacket. I cleared the gate in one leap and sprinted into the light, and just kept running until my lungs wanted to burst. Eventually I stopped when I could see the first house. I looked back at the entrance to the woods. It was quite far away now, and I couldn't see anyone standing there anymore. Relaxing a bit, I finished my walk home. As I walked, I felt a slight tickle on my neck. Reaching behind my head, I felt a warmth. Pulling my hand forward, looking down into my hand, it was covered in blood. My blood. And as if on cue, I heard a maniacal laugh deep within the woods.